Hey there, and thanks for listening to the Beyond These Clinic Walls podcast. I'm your host, Julia, a PT turned product professional, joined by my delightful partner in crime co-hosts, Emma and Emily, founders of the Clinician Transition. Each episode, we interview former rehab professionals who have leveraged their clinical skills into non-traditional roles. I invite you to come hear the journeys, follow the career paths, and learn about the opportunities beyond these clinic walls. On today's pilot episode, I interview my fabulous co-hosts, Emily Kelly and Emma Brady. Emily is a senior client success manager at Prompt Therapy Solutions. She gets her energy from relating to people, collaborating with other professionals, improving processes, and creating solutions to improve outcomes. Emma is the assistant director of sales at Prompt Therapy Solutions. She believes the best way to cure burnout is to prevent it in the first place, with technology like Prompt. Together, they are the co-founders of the Clinician Transition, a community for like-minded rehab professionals to connect and support each other during and after transitions into non-traditional careers. Well, I want to start with a warm welcome to my lovely co-hosts, Emma and Emily. I'm so excited today to flip the mic around in order to hear your journeys and experiences. And I thought, what a better way to kick off our podcast than to interview the two of you and hear a potentially more candid perspective as an introduction to our listeners as well. In preparation for this episode, I really wanted to take a second to reflect and think of a few reasons why a podcast would be so helpful to have a resource for our listeners. One of the things is I'm still very curious and learning how to transition my career. So my background is in physical therapy, and I've recently transitioned out and now have worked as a product manager. And that journey, as cliche as it sounds, had tons of kind of ups and downs, and it's still an ongoing journey. And I'm still always kind of looking and curious to hear other people, their stories, how they've moved to a non-traditional role from coming from a rehab science background. And hopefully we can serve as that voice of question for people who are also going through that transition, to hear everyone's stories, ask the questions. I didn't really know where to start when I started transitioning out. I knew I had some skills in PT, but I really thought it was siloed to rehab sciences. And I didn't even know where to look or like what I wanted to do. So I think that was reason too.
Totally agree. Like when I was looking to transition, there weren't a lot of people who had introduced themselves as PTs, not doing patient care. It was, I'm not a PT anymore. And they were just like, I don't want to talk about that. There wasn't that narrative of like, you can do other things as a PT. It's either you're in direct patient care doing physical therapy or you're no longer a PT. So that was another like big reason that I enjoy doing this kind of stuff, just to show people that, we can kind of control that narrative of like, you're still a PT, we're expanding our scope. We are not leaving the profession. It's not bad for the profession, it's good for the profession. And we're taking seats at other tables so that people in patient care can have better lives too.
Yeah, those were my other two reasons. I literally wrote them down because one, it was to uplift the profession. And I feel like you touched on it so much. Like there's this stigma on almost like taboo when PTs aren't practicing PT anymore. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, you left PT because you didn't like it anymore. Like when I tell people, I'm like, oh, by training, I'm a physical therapist, but now I work X, Y, and Z. They're like, oh, you didn't like PT. And that's not the case at all. Like I like PT. I love what it stands for. I like the profession as a whole, but I wanted to do more and I wanted to see where else I could take those skills. And just kind of the clinic facing route wasn't doing it for me. I wanted to kind of see where else it can grow. I think the biggest thing about at least PT specifically, and we're going to have to get some OTs, SLPs, and all the other rehab professionals on here, but I feel like one of the constant hurdles that we have to do is educate the public on what we know and how we treat, because that's building up the profession. By moving into other roles, I think we're really able to do that. The first question I want to start with, because at least for me, I want to know what got you into PT in the first place, because I think that was also what made me leave PT on my end. But I want to hear from you guys.
Well, for me, I don't have that. Oh, I was a varsity sports player and I got hurt and I went to PT and I was inspired. That is not my journey at all. I was super analytical, anxious person, and I had to figure out what I was going to do early on. So I, started volunteering at the local children's hospital thinking I wanted to be a nurse. Quickly realized that wasn't a fit for me. I was thought way too smart to be a doctor. That's also a crazy but essentially, it was I really liked the medical field and I didn't want it to be life or death. And the magazines were saying that PT was the number one job. I started chatting with PT and I really, really enjoyed it. And then in hindsight, I ended up making life or death decisions because I was an ICU PT. So that was kind of a weird full circle moment for me. And then I went to Northeastern. I graduated in 2014. I did their direct entry program straight from high school.
It's so funny, Emma, you said you didn't do the sports thingy because you just pegged me exactly. I was an athlete. I tore my ACL. I had to go to physical therapy. It was a good experience. I was inspired, blah, blah, blah. I had a really, really good outcome, actually. So better afterwards than I even was prior to tearing my ACL. And it actually, well, like it seems so cliche, but it was actually a really good experience. And I loved that like one-on-one education. And I didn't really know like what PT exactly did. I thought there was a lot of like cool fixing you got to do, like, oh, I push here and that fixes something. And I thought we almost got to be like mechanics of the human body. And I learned later that is not what we do, and that's not how that really works. But anyways, that's what drew me in, and then I found out after my application, and there's like 10 other people at the same store. We like had all torn our ACLs and
I tore my ACL too. What ACL? Which leg did you tear?
right leg.
Oh, I'm a left leg. We balance out.
Yeah,
So good. What did you get? What graft did you get?
patella. And
Oh,
I
okay.
had a lot of issues with it.
Yeah, patellar tendonitis.
Yep, still
Yeah,
get it.
yeah. That's why I got the hamstring one. It's doing okay. But I'm much more of
Yeah.
like a recreational athlete now. I like that you brought up that one-on-one. I don't know if it was with patients or kind of just the whole scope of PT itself, but I find that PT is so different than any other kind of medical profession where you're seeing the patient so frequently, at least in the outpatient setting. And so, like, you're really kind of developing this customer experience, this patient experience, and a relationship on so many different levels beyond just kind of like a medical, but this like social, emotional, so many other ways of kind of communicating with the patient. And I think long term, that's kind of one of the skills that I've found has been able to be translated beyond these clinic walls. Wow, so cheesy. I think we need to make a sound effect for when I say that. So, okay, so here's my story. I applied thinking that I was applying for a 3+2 master's in biomedical engineering. I hit the wrong button on the drop down screen and got into the PT program because it was the same kind of like science and all those prereqs, same kind of similar application, and it came down to that. So me applying, I got into the PT program, thinking it was the master's program for biomedical engineering. It was not. And my mom, I got the letter in the mail like a month later, and my mom was like, "Did you apply for this?" And I was like, "I don't think so." But then, kind of similar as you, Emma, the more I looked into it, same thing. I wanted to kind of go into the medical field. I had a background more in kind of like sports and what I would associate then with like outpatient PT care. That was kind of always of interest to me. And it was the same thing where I wanted to be medical enough, but without the life or death. That was a good way of putting it. And so then I did the PT program. So I maybe got in by accident, but I very much graduated and finished and became a PT, not by accident.
That is the best getting into PT story I've ever heard.
What point did you guys start being like, maybe this isn't the end for me being in PT? When did you guys start getting like fidgety?
Well, for me in PT school, I just knew that I didn't want to do patient care forever. And I was good going into patient care, but I remember telling my best friend, I was like, I don't want to do patient care forever. And I didn't know like what that meant. I didn't know if I wanted to do academics because I actually really loved PT school and I didn't even like part of me just didn't even want to ever graduate. But I wanted to do something different always. And then it was about that 5 year mark. I had made a big like paradigm shift in how I thought about PT. And I just started to get, like you said, it was just like that fidgety, like, okay, I'm ready for my next move now.
That's interesting that you felt that way even before graduating. For me, I kind of had this like glisten in my eye that I'm like, after school, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of like nest in this and get, like, and kind of be that best clinician that I can be. And I think I was. I think, like you said, you're a good clinician. You can definitely be a good clinician, but you can also not be super happy with it, or you can like start getting fidgety. And I see a lot of people start getting to this crossroads too, whether that be 5 years out or kind of like right out of school, where you're like, is clinical the route I want to go? Or is there a non-traditional route I can take this? Emma, when did you start getting the fidgets? The technical term.
I didn't mention this earlier about kind of how I got into physical therapy, but I applied to PT school and got in by accident. I'm the exact opposite. I basically had to beg Northeastern to let me in. I remember the summer after I was an orientation leader, and the guy that I hounded pointed to me and said, Emma Brady, South Burlington High School. I remember you. Like from a year later, he remembered. And looking back on it now, I've never thought about this until right now. Might be why I'm good at sales, actually. But anyway, so from the beginning, PT school was always a struggle. I'm much more actually of a literary person, but again, just based on analytics and the math I had done and everything else, I thought PT was the way for me. So I really kind of forced my way through it all 6 years. I had a good time, I got a good education, but man, I would say less than 1% of it came naturally to me. It was always a huge struggle, a miracle that I passed the boards. It was a lot of hard work. But anyways, I got to the point is there is this immediate concern of being passing PT school. And then it was like, oh my God, I feel like I passed PT school and I still don't really know what I'm doing. I still, um, but I was able to find a setting that actually really clicked with me, and that was inpatient. I really like the hospital. That came super naturally to me. And for whatever reason, I don't feel like that setting super highlighted in school. It is very outpatient based. So that was kind of a relief of like, okay, this is my tribe. This is how I think. I don't have to worry that if someone can move their thumb a little bit one way and then they can move it more the other way. No, it's a way more global, holistic approach to things. Ver- Versus, I dabbled in outpatient for a second and it's like, well, my knee hurts if I'm sitting and I think about this one thing. Okay, well, can you walk 200 feet? Great. So,
Yeah, the goal setting is so drastically different in both settings.
yeah. But the point there is I loved the hospital. I loved the ICU. I was able to have so many professional opportunities that I think I wouldn't have had in a more traditional brick and mortar outpatient clinical setting. And I was able to do process improvement projects at the national level, save the hospital millions of dollars. And what was shocking to me is if I came to my supervisor or director, whoever, with an idea, it was a big eye roll of like, oh my God, Emma Brady has another idea. F word, and and so and that was really hard for me because I really saw myself working there for a while and continuing to do all these process improvements and making that place better. And it always felt like it was more of a burden on them than something that was celebrated. And that's when I started to kind of look into maybe more of a startup environment that would be more open to change and forward thinking and not seeing that as something that you're only going to get a 3 out of 5 on your end of year review, blah, blah, blah. When I should get a 10 out of 5, man. I'm saving you guys millions of dollars. I mean, I guess so. That's kind of.
I think you bring up a personality that I see so often in like PTs as a whole is that like we're very much like a go-getter, problem-solving bunch. And I think when we get our hands on something we're passionate about, and it might not just be an ACL, we can take it very far. But it's tough when we don't always have that support. And I think sometimes just the higher ups or the viewers of it is being like, okay, this is just the PT, do we trust him with this? Like, get back to your heel slides. And yeah, and I think that's something I see so often though. But PTs as a whole and OTs and SLPs, I really find that there's this go-getter attitude. And I think we have this clinical skill to break down problems that are challenging, make them into smaller, more digestible pieces, and really come up with solutions, because that's how we've been taught to think clinically and diagnose, but also kind of bring in this layer of personality and patient care where we're still treating people as humans. What drew you to PT school, Emily? What were kind of some of the takeaways that you liked there? Do you think it was like the structure of it? Like, why did you love school so much?
As I like reflect back on it, I start to realize that I love school because I loved organizing information. And so I thought that I just loved PT, which I do, but I actually am really good at like studying something, breaking it down, teaching it to other people, and that's just like my jam. Like the study groups were just my favorite, and like color coding and like coming up with fun ways to remember things. Like I think that's what I really enjoyed about PT school. And interestingly enough, like Emma, how you got into PT school, you think that is like why you're good at sales, but I think that's why I'm also drawn to CS, because I love that organizing of information and teaching people.
And for listeners that don't know the abbreviation CS, customer success. Yeah. Well, I always want to break that down because a year and a half ago when I was looking at jobs, I was like, I don't even know CSM. Isn't that the PT conference? Like, not like customer success manager. So I'm like, oh yeah, I know what CSM is. No, I don't know. I feel like you were saying like at some point that you kind of like convinced yourself that this like love of what you're doing was a love for PT, but it was like a love of the process. And I think it took me a while to realize myself, but it took me like you got it like right away in PT school. For me, it took me 4 years in practicing PT that I was like, oh, I don't love this part of it. I like the process of it, and I like taking aspects of it. And so, Emma, I'm wondering what aspects that you took from PT and carried over to sales, and how you discovered that sales journey and why you would be good at it.
I think the main point is I took good care of my patients and I made them better, but I also was able to see the bigger picture and essentially sell it to them. Okay, you're sitting in the ICU, your entire body's broken, you have a tube down your throat. Let's get up and go for a walk. Most people aren't going to say, jump out of bed for that. So anytime there is a particularly complex, like, oh, this one's going to be a real, humdinger. Let's put Emma
Real
on it.
humdinger.
So, yeah,
I love it.
and I would love it. Like, what's the weirdest one in the in basket? I'll pick that. And then, kind of some of those projects that I alluded to, those, getting the chief of cardiovascular surgery at a huge medical conglomerate to agree to change their post-op protocol, that took a lot of sales. Or getting the nurses buy-in on using the lift equipment, or getting my department to go from paper to electronic and teaching them how to do that. Just things that affected the entire hospital. Oh, another good one was they had these little hotel packets for people with little mini shampoo bottles and all this stuff that would get thrown out, and it drove me crazy. So much waste and all this other. And if I had to hear about what trash bin the toothpaste went in one more time, I'm like, well, if we just didn't give it out in the first place, I wouldn't have to worry about throwing this thing out. So getting those discontinued and having to convince hospital leadership and the patient group and doing the math on how much money they would save by not buying those anymore. I think that all really translates very well to sales.
creating that buy-in from your patients and then translating it to whatever stakeholders that you encounter next. Yeah, I totally agree. I was thinking the other day too about some of the skills that translate that I've had to work with in PT and how they pertain to product, but also I think just generally a different career that I think initially I thought I was just so siloed in PT that I was like, oh, I'm a one trick pony being here. But how, like, what other skills could I bring? I think creating that buy-in, but how to create buy-in. And that was having empathy with our patients and being able to put ourselves in their shoes. For me, in product, it's important because when you're creating a feature or working on a product that you want the end user to use, it has to be what they want or what they think they want. And a lot of times in the clinic, I'd be working with a patient and I'd create the most beautiful PT care plan and home exercise program. And then they wouldn't do it at all. They wouldn't even touch it. And they're not even going to get better at that. I was like, this is perfect. But it was because I wasn't looking at them. I was doing what I think they wanted, not what they needed. And even though it had all the components that you'd learn in school to have a beautiful care plan, it wasn't going to be conducive to their life. So kind of being able to have that empathy and understand where they're coming from and then building that buy-in, I think was something really valuable that I was able to take from clinic and then beyond these clinic walls. Oh my God. The other thing was being able to teach patients and then articulate and communicate effectively, especially for people who are non-clinical, so your patients. So people who don't understand all the anatomy, physiology, how are you going to break that down into layman's terms and have them leave the clinic knowing and being that much more, have that much more autonomy over their health? But that can pertain to any complex thing. And Emily, that's kind of what you're talking about too, being able to take a problem, break it down, and then teach it back to someone. I think is huge.
You said something, Jules, that was really interesting to me. Just like in passing right there, you said, and get what people want or what they think they want. Because sometimes in product too, that is a difference. And in PT, that's a difference. So do you have like ways that you think about that?
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to just testing it because I think coming to people with, like, for product speaking, to coming to them with a prototype and being like, this is what you said you want, but let's see how you're actually using this. And then also going back, I think, to kind of just like the analytical thinking and kind of looking at the data, which we've been so many times taught through PT, is really looking at the problem and not getting carried away throughout a diagnosis. So, like, many times I've had a patient that comes in and I set them on a care plan and they're doing good. They're not doing great. And then they kind of like start going off course a little bit. And I'm like, okay, do I like run and I attack where they're going next? Or do I follow back up and like look at my data, look at my metrics, look at my subjective and objective, really evaluate it and keep it on course? And I think that's what's helped me too in product, is not to just kind of like chase a symptom, but to kind of look back at those metrics and then really be able to kind of pull from that data. So I think that's been super helpful when I've been problem solving there.
That's just like beautiful correlate between patient care and product development.
Drawing parallels. And by no means am I an expert. And I'm so excited for when we get more product people on here because I will totally monopolize the conversation and ask them all these things as well. My next question is, do you guys regret leaving the clinic at all? Do you have any regrets? No regrets.
Zero. I have just zero regrets. I have zero regret. I think one thing that I realized when I was treating is that even though I was passionate about, there was like this disconnect. I was like, this is weird. I'm so passionate about what I do in the profession. And for some reason, I'm still like really drained of energy at the end of a day. And I didn't know if that was just like working life, because that's what you hear sometimes. Oh, they don't call it work for no reason. It's work. Or, I had this inkling that, maybe I'm passionate about the profession. I'm just not in my strength zone, if that makes sense. But now I'm doing things that's more in my zone of what I'm good and like naturally strong at, like working on projects. I'm customer facing part of the day, but not all day, every day. And I get those breaks take a breath and just like focus, like get in that deep focus work where like time goes by super fast and I'm not drained at the end of the day.
You brought up burnout, and I feel like burnout is such a like a buzz term now, and like something that affects everyone. And I think that I was hitting a point. I think many people that will be listening to this and then who like seek out transitioning out of PT, burnout is going to be one of those top reasons. You're right in saying that like it's not impossible to be burnt out at doing something you really enjoy, but when it plays to your strengths and it's just that much more like you have a passion towards it and you're I think going to be much more successful and actually have that ambition to proceed. That was something when I was hitting burnout, I was like, even if I wasn't this exhausted and tired, would I still be loving this? And when I said no to that answer, I was like, yeah, I think it's time. It's time to move along.
I also have zero regrets. I still remember telling my director at the acute hospital that I was going to go leave for a startup, not the one I'm at now, the one in between my acute care job and my current role. I said I'm leaving for a startup, and he said, "I'm jealous of you." And I couldn't believe it because here's a man who I've been giving heartburn to for the past 5 years. Just the way he said it, it was like he knew that was the space for me. I knew that was the space for me. And he goes, "The opportunities that are going to come your way from this and where your career is going to go." And so he kind of predicted that, and it ended up being true. So yeah, I definitely have no regrets.
That's great that you had that feedback and support from that. I think a lot of people get concerned about telling people that they're leaving. Have you had not so positive feedback or like people question?
My start to transition to non-clinical, non-traditional work started a long time ago. It started 5 years in, and I've been a therapist for 12 years now. I feel like we've come a long way in the past 5 to 7 years because at that point, I was looking sort of for other non-traditional jobs and really scared to tell my colleagues, like super nervous. Like, I don't even know. I'll have to like make up a story or something because I'm so nervous about telling people. But as I don't know if it was just like personal development or just where the profession has come in that time, but by the time I actually got a job with Prompt, it was no problem at all. I told my boss and I was like very confident about it. And some of my colleagues were like, "Oh man, that's so cool. I'm kind of jealous." So by that time, it was just like no big deal. But at first, my family was like, "Are you sure? Like you went to school for all those years?" And
Yeah. And it's you've created almost an identity for yourself because you say, I'm Julia Biedrzycki, PT, DPT, like as if my last name needed more letters. But you've created this identity that you're like, I'm a physical therapist. This is what I do. And then people hear that and you're like, I'm medical, I treat, this is what I do. For me as well, it was like, oh, I have this identity. Now I don't really think I like that identity. Who am I now?
I kind of felt I can relate to that with the identity crisis, and it's something like as I talk, Emma and I talk to a lot of people who are trying to transition. And I see that identity crisis a lot, and that's where I think that the narrative of like shifting it a little bit of like I'm Emily Kelly, I'm a PT, and I do customer success, but like PT is still in that identity.
Yeah, that's what I've kind of actually learned to say too. I'm like by training, I'm a physical therapist, and currently I work as product. But yeah, I think that it's still an important part of me that I want to include, and it's still something that I've worked really hard on, though I hit the wrong drop down button. I still worked hard on it. And it is still part of my identity and it's still part of my experience, and it's something that will definitely be carried forward with whatever next job I go to. First started thinking about changing or transitioning out of patient-facing care, what were your first steps? Did you feel completely lost? Did you know what to do? What was kind of like that first thing you latched onto to kind of make a path?
When I first started exploring options, I happened to run into an old coworker who told me about this group called the Bay Area Non-Clinical Meetup, which is now what we know as the clinician transition. So I check that out because I knew I wanted to do the startup thing. And then I heard about Meredith Caston's course. I don't think we can get through an episode of something like this without mentioning one of the pioneers in this space. So I took that course, did some informational interviewing with people who had already switched, and that's how I got my first. It wasn't really I think there's traditional, non-traditional, and then there's kind of this new hybrid of non-traditional, traditional PT. So that was my first uh, role outside of the hospital, was this hybrid of the non-traditional, traditional.
Can you break those down a little bit? I like that classification.
Yeah, so I think of traditional as what we went to PT school for, outpatient, acute care, home health, SNF. And then I think of fully non-traditional, kind of what we're doing, product, CS, sales, UX, UI, engineering, all that sort of thing. And then the non-traditional, traditional are more these hybrid of telehealth or working for startups like Hinge or Sword or Physera, Origin, those types of really forward thinking physical therapy companies where you're still doing some direct patient care, but it's not in the sense that you would think of in, say, a mill. And I think that's kind of where some of the profession is going, is this more forward thinking way. And that's a good way, I think, to we kind of briefly mentioned burnout earlier. And I think that's kind of a path that some people are taking to still see patients without necessarily going fully non-traditional.
Yeah, I see that. And you brought up kind of that like starting five, I'll call them, of the forward thinking PT startups where it's like the Hinge, the Physera. I think that was kind of my first stop too, where I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if there was a way that like we can kind of digitize this PT? And I think, of course, the pandemic helped speed everything up, and just kind of when, the clinic doors closed, the Zoom doors opened and allowed so much through that window. That was my first stop. And then I kind of tried to challenge myself to think beyond just the obvious of PT digitized and where else, even medical and product wise, it could take me. For me, one of the big things was I had to kind of reflect back and be like, why am I frustrated at physical therapy? Or like, why am I frustrated in this setting? And I think it was because of healthcare as a whole, which to to tackle that is impossible. We can't do that as a country, let alone one individual PT. So I tried to figure out what I could do, what's one problem I could solve, and how would I solve that. And that helped me kind of find the direction that I wanted to grow in. That was communication between a patient and all kind of stakeholders in their care. So caregivers, providers, everything. And I just found this huge disconnect, especially in outpatient care where I was in a private outpatient clinic. And it was just so difficult to communicate with patients and their providers. Like we would still be getting faxes. And I was like, it's 2015. Why are we still getting faxes? Like this shouldn't be a method. And I was like, how cool would it be to have a solution that connects everyone seamlessly, which is definitely looking at things through rose-colored lenses. But that started me thinking about like the other solutions out there, not just PT focused, but healthcare, and where I've had experience to grow and where I could probably make a difference from the experience I had. And that's where I found like where I currently work is at a startup that's like digital patient management and helping patients get connected to the resources they need throughout their care journey. And I'm in no position to really give full advice, but it was something that helped me, was to think of like a problem that you would want to solve, think of a solution and see if there's companies out there that are already doing that and see where you could fit in. So that was kind of the one thing I latched on to. Emily, did you have a starting point?
I Googled what else can I do?
Yes. I totally skipped that part. I made it seem like that was fine. There's several meltdowns in there, a lot of Googling, a lot of like,
Yes.
what is a job? Like, how do I interview? All those other fun things too.
Yeah, I mean, that literally was my first step though, and I came across some really jaded forums, but eventually I found Meredith Caston's, like her first blog, and she was the first person, because I kind of talked to some other PTs who had transitioned. And again, it was like, oh, I'm not a PT anymore. And she was the first PT, or it was always the same narrative of like, I want to be a PT. I swear that I do, but like my back hurts too much. Or like, and I was like, well, I can't blame it on my back because my back doesn't hurt. So I need, and Meredith was the first person to not have that narrative. She was just like, I just don't want to do this anymore. I need to do something else, and I'm not going to feel like a jerk for it. There's not like because there is a sense of like shame around
It is so
not
much,
doing yes
right?
patient
I
care.
know. It's like
So
you're
I
not tough
connect.
enough to do this. You're not tough
Yes,
enough to burn
can't
yourself
hack
out
it.
every day. Yeah. Get your life together. No. No, I feel that shame is 100%.
I started it. I want to finish it. I want to. But yeah, I connected with Meredith and she was just awesome. And I did her course, and that was like my first foray into like looking for non-clinical work. Meredith was a big influence. She was like, the first. And again, that also goes to why I think this podcast is really important in the clinician transition because it's good for people to see PTs doing other things as or OTs, whatever, SLPs, and still calling themselves PTs or OTs or SLPs. So that's kind of what Meredith did for me. Like she normalized it, took the shame out of it. And then I felt like more okay about like looking. And so I started looking and applying and got a ton of rejections and decided that my next role was not going to be a non-clinical role or non-traditional role. I actually needed to go from the private practice setting, outpatient therapy, to a large hospital because it was just going to have more opportunities. So I did that and I started getting involved with like process improvement and helping people make their documentation smoother. And just like I, I got on the process improvement team and I just started like looking around the clinic almost like a playground, like what little things can we tweak just to make this experience, yeah, like more seamless. Like days that I could do that stuff, I would just come home like so excited. And my husband was like, "You are the weird person that likes like policy changes and like rewrite." And I was like, "Yes, that is yes."
Yeah. But it's also like so satisfying though, right? Where you like come up with this hypothesis, you test it, it works, and then you see the outcomes of it, which sounds crazy similar to PT and treating and like having a patient be successful. I think the workflows and processes that you manage are so gratifying also in the sense that you get this reward that you don't always get with patients because sometimes you could do everything in your power to make a patient feel better and they're just not going to get better. And it's just kind of out of your control. And over time, that kind of beats you down. You're not able to you're like, I did everything I could and I still didn't get them better. But then being able to implement this in a workflow and have that same process and then have that positive effect and get that gratification, I think is great. So I can totally see how I would also be nerding out with you on that.
Totally. I feel like the space that I'm in now is such a better fit because I'm so, like you were saying, task oriented instead of like I feel like people who are less attached to like achieving a task or like getting a task done maybe are more likely to be in patient care and get a lot of satisfaction out of it.
I think it also allows you to branch out in ways that would otherwise be muted in the clinical setting. So like for me, I like to be like really creative and I like to come up with like problem solving that after a certain time, there's so many patterns in the clinic that even though every patient is different, that repetition starts happening over time and you don't really have these creative outlets where you can express yourself a little bit more and then be challenged. And so for me, finding an area where I can be regularly challenged and have to come up with creative solutions without having that pattern was also something that was good for me to kind of explore and be able to hone in on.
I got off way on a tangent, but Emma, we could talk about how we met if you want.
Yeah, let's start there. So I met that coworker and then I went to this Bay Area non-clinical meetup, and at the same time I knew that there was also one in Colorado the Front Range. With COVID, it went virtual. And so during that time, that's when I did the informational interview and I found someone who was already a PT working in the startup world. And I was applying for a startup that was intended for people who are obese to help them lose weight. And they wanted to add a PT component to it. So what I thought I was getting into was opening up a telehealth program during COVID for these patients. And I was super jazzed about it. But I knew this is that non-traditional that I'm talking about with the telehealth. And they had an app that they had built and they were using modern technology and science to do this, all this sort of thing. So I did an informational interview and he said, looked at the job, looked at the company and said, they're going to want you to say these 10 things. So I basically transcribed my informational interview with this person. And in the interview, I believed everything I was saying. None of it was disingenuous, just the sort of startup phrases or things they want to hear, I'd pepper in there. And then when I got the call back, they said, I really liked when you said XYZ. I was like, yes. If I hadn't done that interview, I never would have known that. I wouldn't have gotten the job. Once I got there, though, kind of back to the theme of, not being ashamed and of your identity and that sort of thing. I just am not an outpatient PT. I don't know what I was thinking. Beyond the clinical, though, beyond those clinical struggles, there was very real problems of the EMR sucked. The scheduling sucked. The HEP sucked. Nothing talked to each other. It was just a logistical nightmare. It was a disaster. But while this is all going on, basically day one, I'm looking for an exit plan. Like, okay, this was crazy. I don't know what I was thinking doing this. And so then I always just kind of seen Emily on LinkedIn. I was aware of who she was, and we ended up connecting and just kind of keeping in touch here and there. And I went to her group just to learn more about it, any option I could possibly have to get out of my current job. It just was a mess. And then in my search for a solution professionally and also logistically with this company, because we were looking into other software options, it just wasn't working. I happened to run into Prompt and I dropped everything I was doing. So I was like, this is not only the solution to all my problems, I also really believe in the mission. It's very synergistic, I think, with what I do with the clinician transition. I think so much of what we see is completely preventable. The burnout of I'm taking my notes home and I'm doing all this stuff, yada, yada. I think we solve a lot of those problems. But the real point is when people come to me and ask for help, a lot of it is there's just such a different tone to I'm super burnt out, I'm seeing a million patients, I'm writing notes, I'm super miserable versus I really like process improvement, or I really like seeing patients with Parkinson's. How do I become a Parkinson's researcher? How do I do project? Those are two separate buckets of people I put them into. And when I see that I'm burnt out, but I still like PT, that kills me because I think if the process was improved by someone who enjoyed that work, they could focus on the patients. So once I joined Prompt, kept in touch with Emily, went to her group, and then eventually I was asked to take over what is now known as the clinician transition. Emily was doing hers, and we just kind of decided to join forces. Lauren, who started the group, started the Rehab Tech Summit around the same time and was kind enough to give us a free booth at it. And she said, well, if you want to do the booth, you have to have a logo. It had to be rebranded. So I rebranded. I went on Canva, put a little logo on it, and that was it. And then all of a sudden it looked super official. So we had a list of, I don't know, about 30 people at that time. It was a Google Doc of some sort that we share around, and I made a LinkedIn group. And then Emily and I joined forces there, and she actually pinged me wanting to learn more about Prompt, asking about a sales role. And I said, well, I don't know you that well, Emily. I creepily know you from LinkedIn. I know your story from LinkedIn, but I'm pretty sure I think you'd be a better fit for customer success. Oh, and conveniently, we also have an opening for customer success and we don't for sales. And so Emily was one of the people on my list when I got a prompt of like, who am I going to get into the tribe? She was towards the top. And that's exactly what happened. She was our second TCT hire.
That is best rendition than I could ever verbalize. I had started our little Denver group because I love community. Like if I'm going through something, especially a career transition, I just think community is so important. And I was honestly doing it partially for community, and then partially we would invite guests on, so it was a good excuse to like talk to people. It was easy to get them to come on because it was like kind of flattering for them. Kind of looking into account management, and then Emma, like she said, was like, "You might be good at that, but you would probably be really good, a much better fit for customer success." And once she described what they were looking for, I was like, yes, that's exactly what I want to do. And then it's just been a perfect fit.
I know we have so much to cover and I want to do it all in one episode, and I want to cut us off here though because I want this to just kind of be like a taste of all those additional things that we're going to go into, and all of our next episodes are going to be interview style, so we're going to be bringing in people with a bunch of different perspectives from different career trajectories, and then hopefully even maybe getting some people who work as recruiters and people that can offer insight to what to look for when you are transitioning jobs and all those other skills that you don't always necessarily get coming out of PT school. So that kind of job searching, that networking, all of those fun things. But excited to be here.
I got a lot more to say, but if you want to hear it, you're going to have to listen to the next episode.
I like that.
That's how we're going to end.
That's gold. That's gold.
If you've listened this far, hey mom and dad. Thanks to everyone for listening to Beyond These Clinic Walls podcast. Be sure to follow us on social media at LinkedIn and on Instagram for all the latest updates and episode releases. Also, make sure to check out and join the Clinician Transition page on LinkedIn, a community for non-traditional, like-minded rehab professionals. Do you know someone who would make an excellent guest on our next show? Reach out to us at beyondtheseclinicwalls@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening.